Here, when we talk about the really advances in myeloma that we've seen, we can see clearly that in the first, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, really had no new therapeutic drugs. We had melphalan, we had Cytoxan, we had vincristine, doxorubicin, really nothing else for many, many years. And really since 1999 on forward, in the last 10 years, that's when thalidomide is approved. Then more recently, in the last 7 to 8 years, Velcade and Revlimid, Doxil. So all these drugs have been approved more recently. That's based on really this active involvement in clinical research. So again, when's the right time? It can be not when you're out of other options, but at any point in time, early on or at relapse disease. You can find out about where these, so this again was a slide just saying that when's the right time? It's really not when you're out of other options or at the last resort. We can have phase 1 trials or phase 3 trials in newly diagnosed, early lines of therapy or relapse setting. And how do you find out about these trials and where are they available? They're available at most academic centers. They're also available at many community centers as well. And there's multiple good resources to look into to find out where trials are available, what trials may be good options for you. You can look at the MD Anderson website. You can look at the Mayo Clinic website. The IMF or the MMRC have good websites, as well as clinicaltrials.gov or cancer.gov. So a couple of last very important take-home points for clinical trials. It's important to understand that there's multiple different types of trials from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, prevention trials, therapeutic trials. So it's important to understand what kind of trial you're being involved in or asked to be involved in. The second and most important point that I really haven't focused on here, but it's important for the patients to ask the physician about what my clinical trial options are. And so we always talk about, a challenge enrolling to these clinical trials. I think it's a two-part issue, and sometimes physicians are not very good at giving you your clinical trials options. And so in my mind, it's always important to understand what your clinical trial and your non-clinical trial options are. So you should always ask your physician, is there a good clinical trial for me? If you don't have one here, is there somewhere else that you think is a good option for me? Phase 1, quote unquote, is something not to be scared of. Just understand what you're getting into. It's a major commitment both from the patient and the physician. It's really the only way to make progress in the field, and that's why we're standing here today with the benefits that we've seen so far. So what are the clinical trials that are ongoing? What are some of these new drugs? Dr. Kyle alluded to some of these, and I'm going to briefly describe a bit more of this as well. And so there's really a whole laundry list of new drugs that are being developed. If you go on some of these websites, you'll see a list of 20 and 30 different trials that are ongoing with new drugs. I'm going to try and focus on some of the more active, more promising combinations that are available currently. So we'll start off with one class of drugs called proteasome inhibitors. And so that's what Velcade falls under. So that's one of our first proteasome inhibitors that we have. And there's a number of new proteasome inhibitors that are being looked at currently. And we'll start off with Carfilzomib. And so Carfilzomib is a new proteasome inhibitor. It's also given IV. Right now it's given days 1 and 2, 8 and 9, so twice a week, every week for 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And what we've seen with the Carfilzomib data so far is that if we look at the far right-hand corner, you'll see an overall response rate, or this ORR, of 57%. That's telling us about 60% of patients who are Bortezomib naive or Velcade naive on the bottom respond to this therapy. And then if you look at what we'd normally expect, you'd normally expect a response rate of around 40%, because that's what the Velcade response rate is. So it's a bit higher than just Velcade. Then if we look at the middle column, we'll see an ORR of 18%, and that's in patients who are Bortezomib refractory. So those are patients who've already had Velcade. Velcade no longer works for them, and about 20% of patients of those respond. So it's not a big number, but it's an important number to build on. Now, one of the benefits of Carfilzomib is really its side effect profile, or the side effects that patients have. And one of the major issues with Velcade has always been the neuropathy that patients experience. And neuropathy, just for those who have not had Velcade yet or are newly diagnosed patients, is the numbness, basically nerve damage that occurs sometimes from the myeloma and sometimes, or oftentimes, from the therapy that we use, including Velcade. And so that will be numbness and tingling or pain that starts off in the tips of the fingers and tips of the toes and moves kind of closer to you. And so in Velcade we see a quite a high incidence of this neuropathy. This is different than what we see in Carfilzomib. So with Carfilzomib, we see a very low incidence of this peripheral neuropathy, this box in green, and very few patients, less than 10% of patients, will really have, and those who do get it will get very, very mild grade 1 neuropathy. We also get some drops in blood counts, but not as significant as we see in Velcade. What we do see a little bit more with Carfilzomib is some issues with fatigue, so patients will get a little bit more fatigue as they stay on therapy a little bit longer, and they may get some problems with their kidneys, so you just have to watch your kidney function in the first 1 or 2 cycles of therapy. Now this is rather early data, and so we have a lot more experience with this combination and a lot more data about this, but this is really the background for why Carfilzomib is moving forward in some of our clinical trials. And so what are the Carfilzomib trials out there currently? And so I think Dr. Kyle alluded to this again also, but there's one trial right now. It's a phase 3 trial, which is the top line here. And basically everybody gets Revlimid and dexamethasone, because Revlimid and dexamethasone is an established, appropriate standard of care. And half the patients get Carfilzomib, half the patients don't. We're trying to see if this is a better active regimen. Again, nobody's getting a sugar pill, everybody's getting Revlimid Dex, which is a really appropriate standard of care. So this trial is ongoing currently at this point in time. Now there's a number of other trials that I've listed down here below. So now Carfilzomib is being looked at in newly diagnosed myeloma. So we're moving forward from the relapse setting into the newly diagnosed setting. And so there's a number of trials around the country at different centers looking at different Carfilzomib combinations, both Carfilzomib plus steroids or Carfilzomib plus Cytoxan. And so, and at MD Anderson, we actually have a couple of trials with Carfilzomib plus Panabinostat, or Array 520, which I'll describe in a bit, or pomalidomide. So that's another active combination as well, where we're trying to combine our two newest therapies, Carfilzomib and pomalidomide together, which we think may be the most active combination. So we're doing that at MD Anderson plus several other centers around the country. What are other proteasome inhibitors out there? There's several other proteasome inhibitors out there that are a little bit farther along in their development. They're still available in clinical trials, but they're not quite as active at this point in time. So we know this drug, MLN9708 and NPI0052, these are oral proteasome inhibitors, so these are pills that you take by mouth instead of IV. And they're still rather early in their clinical trials, and they're moving forward in different trials now at this point in time in newly diagnosed as well as relapse setting in different combinations. And so I think that's a little bit farther behind in Carfilzomib, where we feel fairly confident that this will likely become FDA approved, hopefully sometime in the next year or so. These are a little bit farther along, but they are available to patients as well. So the second class of drugs I want to briefly talk about is something called HDAC inhibitors. And so the first drug is something called Vorinostat or SAHA. And so again, this is a drug that's already completed the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trial. And in the phase 3 trial, they compared Bortezomib or Velcade plus or minus Vorinostat or SAHA. The reason they did this trial, and to kind of share some of the excitement for why they did this trial, again, was when we looked at patients who were Velcade refractory. So Velcade no longer works for these patients. When we combined those two drugs together in these two different trials, whoops,